Welcome to the Add Life to Yours podcast, brought to you by Dendro, where we bring you the latest science-backed advice to help you live healthier. I'm your host, Karl, founder of Dendro, and today we're diving into something that we all do, but rarely understand: sleep. What is it? What happens when we don't get enough? And why should you care about it? Stick around and you'll find out why sleep should be at the top of your priority list when it comes to your health. Joining us today as our expert guest is Dr. Jatin Joshi, a physician, professor, and expert in evidence-based medicine. On top of all this, he's also the founder and chief medical officer of Supplement Technology, as well as a scientific advisor to Dendro. More info on both our backgrounds can be found in the show notes if interested. Now, let's get into it and unpack the science behind sleep health. Without further ado, hope you enjoyed the episode and most importantly, learn something from it that helps you live healthier. Hey Jatin, great to have you here today. Super excited for this session. We got a ton to cover around the overarching theme of sleep health.
Yes.
So maybe we just kick it off with, the broadest question possible. What is sleep? What's going on every night when we go to bed?
Well, it's a question that I talk about a lot, especially with my kids. But I tend to describe sleep as an essential biological process which allows the body to recuperate both physically and mentally. And it's something that's completely essential and, the human body cannot go without. In fact, the mammalian body cannot go without. It's essential to every facet of our lives, from the way we feel, the way we grow, the way we recover, and the way we age. And it's something that I care a lot about, because when people ask me, everyone's always looking for that shortcut to feeling amazing. They said, if there's one thing, that magic bullet that I can do, what should that be? And my answer is always the same. If you sleep better, you'll feel better. And as a pillar of health, I'd say it's probably the first and most important thing that someone can do.
Yeah, no, I definitely couldn't agree more. Actually, what got me into sleep health in the first place was I actually started more looking at preventative health, right? And then I kind of got into the classic healthy habits, the things that are super easy to say, like, sleep better, eat better, exercise more, stress less. But obviously, as we know, very hard to do in reality. And the more I dig into it, I basically just realized, sleep is that clear starting point. It's that undisputable kind of behavior where if you nail your sleep, you're not only more likely to follow through with these other healthy behaviors, but you also get more reward from each one as well.
Absolutely. Think of it as a springboard to everything. For a start, we all sleep. It's not like saying that we all exercise, we all go to the gym, we all eat healthily. No, but we all sleep, and everyone knows what it's like. It's one of those things that you don't actually have to explain to someone, because when someone's had that good night's sleep, that restorative period, they feel amazing the next day. Whereas they could be someone that's super fit, eats well, diets, does everything right, but they have that bad night's sleep, they feel like terrible the next day.
Yeah, you're just not quite the same.
No.
You almost, in some cases, depending on how bad the sleep is, maybe it's even a bit more severe than that, and you're a completely different person in the morning.
Absolutely, and obviously coming from a medical background, we see people that can't sleep because they're in pain or they have other issues, and you realize that allowing a person to sleep aids in their recovery, both mentally and physically, and allows them to be just that best person that they can be. And without that foundation of good sleep, you're running a very difficult battle trying to even control the other parts of your health.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. The day-to-day can be tough enough as it is. If we get a good sleep, we can just make it that much easier. Maybe to get into a bit more about just what actually happens when it comes to our daily or nightly rest. Obviously there's different sleep stages. Do you mind just elaborating a bit more on those sleep stages and what's actually going on when we go to bed?
So principally you can split sleep up into two main phases, one which is called non-REM sleep and one which is called REM sleep, the REM being rapid eye movement, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. Non-REM sleep itself can be divided up into three stages, N1, N2 and N3. N1, you can kind of think of that moment where, you feel yourself just dozing off. It's that very initial period, it can be as little as 10 minutes. N2 is when the body's getting to a slightly deeper form of sleep. Your heart rate slows down, your respiratory rate slows down, and your core temperature starts to decrease. And then we get on to what's called the N3, or the slow wave sleep, or the deep sleep. It's called slow wave because what happens in the brain when you connect it to an electroencephalogram is that you see these large sinusoidal waves, symmetrical ones, and it shows that the body is in this deep state of relaxation. And it's a very important stage of sleep. It's one in which you can think of the body physically repairing itself. It's the one where the physical maintenance side of the body is done. You get release of growth hormone, and it's something that's fundamental to recuperating physically. Now, this occurs in conjunction with a phase of sleep called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And that's called that way because when you look at the brainwave patterns of someone going through REM sleep, it's like they're awake. They're haphazard, they're all over the place. And in that stage of sleep, the body itself is paralyzed. So you're not hurting yourself, you're not hitting out at each other. But that's a really important phase of sleep because it's where the mental restoration comes in. You consolidate your memories from the day, you're clearing out that mental debris that occurs throughout the day. So you could kind of say that the slow wave sleep in the non-REM is for the physical restoration, and for the REM sleep is for the mental restoration side. Usually what happens is in the early parts of the night, so a sleep cycle. We call it a sleep cycle as in when you're going from the beginning of non-REM through REM. The entire process is usually around 90 to 120 minutes long. And you usually try and get through 5 or 6 of those a night if you can. And what happens is that in the early phase of the sleep, the first half of your sleep, the slow wave part, that non-REM part, kind of predominates. The REM part is still there, but it's just not as much and for not as long a duration. But for the second part of the night, the REM part kind of takes over. So it's a balance where in the end you've got the perfect balance between non-REM and REM, where REM sleep is around 20% of the time, but you'll find that it occurs more during the later parts of the night.
Okay, no, that's super interesting. So I guess just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, essentially 2 different types of sleep. We got non-REM, REM, and then within that we have 4 stages.
That's right.
3 stages in the non-REM, N1, N2, more the light sleep, and then N3, the deep sleep, and then the one under REM being what people often refer to as dream sleep.
Yes, that's right. It's called dream sleep, though actually you can dream during any of the other stages. The reason it's called dream sleep, or you get that dream state, is because your mind is so active. It is as if you are awake. And also there are times when, if you're woken up when you're just going through that REM phase, you'll have that slight recollection about it. So it's something that's identified with dream sleep, and it's probably where your most vivid dreams do occur, but it's not just where dreams occur.
Mm-hmm. Okay, no, thank you for clarifying. And I guess the other interesting point that you highlighted was this difference between physical restoration, which comes more with that N3 non-REM deep sleep, as well as mental restoration, which comes more with the REM dream sleep,
Absolutely.
so to speak. So I guess depending on your sleep and whether disruptions maybe occur at the start versus the end, or say a common scenario I think is people often get up a bit earlier than they like to.
Yes.
It's not as simple as just losing an hour of sleep versus relative to your total sleep. Actually, you're losing a much bigger proportion of your overall REM sleep or deep sleep.
And that's a really good way to actually illustrate it, because we said that the slow wave sleep kind of predominates in the earlier part and the REM sleep in the later part. So you're one of those people who are cutting a couple of hours off your sleep. You are missing out on that REM sleep, which is so important for memory consolidation, mental restoration, and for that feeling of clarity that you will get. I'm sure it's something we'll speak about, but it's not something that's easily caught up on either, because you can't say to yourself, oh, I didn't have an hour's sleep there, or I've not slept properly for weeks, I'll just sleep extra at the weekend. It doesn't unfortunately work like that. It's a cumulative effect. So it's really important that that consistency is there throughout.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. And I guess in particular with the case of, being a bit short on your deep sleep or your dream sleep, it's not as simple as taking a nap, because it takes time to get to those deeper, more restorative stages of sleep.
Absolutely. I was one of those people that, while at medical school, think that, you're indestructible and you'll catch the odd nap there. But napping is an issue as well, because we've talked about a sleep cycle being between 90 and 120 minutes long. If you take a nap for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you'll feel okay. You feel a little bit rested, you'll get up. But that's because you've probably just gone into your N1 and N2 forms of your sleep. Whereas if you slept for 60 minutes, you might have got into your slow wave sleep, you might have started your REM sleep, and then you're suddenly up. So you're not getting that full cycle. You'll wake up feeling groggy, and you'll actually feel worse than if you hadn't had a nap at all. So that's why we tend to recommend that if you're going to have a nap, try and have it so it's 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or if you're really tired, try and do it so it's a sleep cycle, 90-minute nap. But do it early in the day, please. Don't do it in the late afternoon, otherwise you might struggle later on.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. And I think one thing also stood out when you mentioned feeling a bit indestructible.
Yeah.
I can also admit I'm definitely guilty of that. I think it's very easy to adopt this, sleep when you're dead mentality.
Yeah.
When the reality is it's kind of just the opposite.
It's ingrained in our culture. People are like, oh no, sleep, that's fine. I can work 20 hours a day. I can only need 4 hours sleep a night. We know that's not true, but even if you were able to get away with that for a short period of time, it's the long-term effects that it can have on your health. It's not great for your brain, it's not good for your heart health, your metabolism, your weight and your appetite and everything. So many things are affected by sleep. That's why this goal to get that good quantity of sleep, the 7 to 9 hours that we talk about all the time, is so important.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, even thinking back myself, I'm a stereotypical Canadian, so of course I played ice hockey through to my university days, and I remember, basically prioritizing exercise, nutrition, mental well-being, often always, over sleep. I would either stay up late to study a bit more.
Yeah.
Or wake up early to catch that workout before class. And the irony is I might have actually just been better off, getting a good night of rest.
You're absolutely right. I remember at medical school, I'd sometimes work through the night, catch 3-4 hours of sleep, and then go to lectures, go into the hospital, whatever. And I'd think to myself, oh, wow, I'm doing 18, 20 hours of work a day, but not realizing actually everything I learned isn't being consolidated by my brain. It needs time to absorb those memories for that mental consolidation to occur that we talk about in REM sleep. And if we're talking about REM sleep only really occurring more proportionally towards the end of sleep, then you definitely need that 7 to 9 hours. So now as a parent, I tell my teenage children that how important it is. You may feel indestructible, but if you really want to be indestructible, lay the foundations now.
Yeah, well, I definitely, looking back on my teenage self, I would say I'd be very happy to sleep more in the absence of say, studying for a test.
Yeah, I mean, but then it's something that I'm sure we'll talk about, our chronotype, what kind of people we are genetically, what kind of genetic predisposition we have to when we sleep. Some people feel at their happiest, at their best. Early in the morning, they wake up refreshed, but they get tired early. They want to get to bed early. Some people, if you ask them to do a task at 9 o'clock in the morning, they'll think you're crazy because they need time to get up, and they work best later on and maybe even into the night. And that's not something that, you're saying, oh, look, just get up and do that. That's not the way it is. They're just genetically predisposed to that way of being. But unfortunately, because of society the way it is, and with work patterns being constituted through the Industrial Revolution, where we were told to wake up early and then start work early in the morning and then go to bed at night, it kind of means that everyone has to adapt their chronotype to what it's like. Now, obviously that's not going to be practical for everyone, but if there is a way that you can adapt your work patterns, your study patterns to the kind of chronotype that you are, you'll find that your sleep is much more effective and you'll actually feel mentally restored from that. I think I remember once you and I were talking about were people able to switch their chronotype, go from that owl, that late sleeper, to a lark, that morning person. But I think most studies have showed that there could be a small switch, maybe an hour, 90 minutes, but even that's not fully effective, and it's about adaptation and trying to fit into whatever predisposition you are around your life at this.
No, it makes sense, and I can say I'm definitely guilty of being a night owl, so I feel the pain of
Is that what you are? Are you an owl chronotype?
Definitely, okay. Without question, an evening type. So I feel that pain of society being a bit more designed for the early bird, so to speak.
Yeah.
Maybe before we jump a bit more into chronotype and circadian rhythm and some other key sleep concepts, I think you've done a really amazing job of explaining a lot of the basics or fundamentals behind what is sleep. I think the next logical question is, like, why should we care about sleep? And you already mentioned so many different reasons, but perhaps we can frame it through the lens of, what actually, both the negative and positive. So what actually happens when you don't get enough sleep and you're sleep deprived, as well as on the converse side, what are the positive effects when you do get enough sleep and you've hit that sufficient sleep level. So maybe just to start with the first one, would love to dive in on, what are some of those negative implications for our mind and body when we're running short on sleep.
So as we've discussed, the reason you sleep for several things that are required. So you can take them piece by piece. Your cognitive state, what your brain's like, your metabolic state, what your body's processes are like, and we can go on from there. When someone doesn't sleep as well, because we keep going back to non-REM, but because they don't get that mental restoration, they'll find that their clarity isn't as good. They're unable to focus. They might be slightly moody or irritable. They will just not be able to perform at their normal level, let alone a peak. And that's why when you talk to people and they're studying for exams, it's so important to tell them that, the sleep is such an important part. You can try and stay up late to learn everything, but you will not be at your peak to put those things down. But it's not just that, because when we talked about what happens during those phases of sleep, during the slow wave sleep, there's hormones are released, and the body's hormonal system is affected. No, those hormones actually affect the entire bodily system. So it's been found in people that don't sleep well, they don't recover well from illnesses because their immunity is depressed. They're more predisposed to cardiovascular problems, heart attacks, heart disease and the like, and they tend to, because of the hormonal imbalance, gain weight faster. Now, it's not because they're not sleeping that these things happen, so we can't say it's completely causative, but there is a strong correlation between all of these things. You have them sleep well, their metabolic health will be better, so therefore their cardiovascular health will be better, their neuronal and brain health will be better, therefore their focus and clarity will be better. So it's difficult to explain to people, and they'll come back to you and say, well, you're saying everything, all my problems are because I'm not sleeping well. I'm saying it's not a magic bullet, but it is probably the most important part of your health routine that you can do to avoid all of those problems later on in life.
No, I think that for me was the biggest eye-opening realization when I started to dig into sleep health, was just, wow, this is truly interlinked to everything, as you mentioned, whether it's nutrition, physical health, mental health, or even lowering the risk of chronic diseases later in life. Sleep is just so truly intertwined with everything health related.
Yeah, we know so little. I mean, even at this advanced stage of medicine, we know so little about the body, about the various interactions between hormones, chemicals, our metabolism. But the thing is that you have to realize that when you are at your peak, when your sleep is at its best, all of these processes work in complement to each other. So you'll find that people that do get good amounts of sleep generally are healthier, generally don't tend to be as overweight, generally don't suffer from cardiovascular or diabetes or anything like that. So yes, it is that magic bullet sometimes, but it's why it's that magic bullet.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And even what you said around some of the hormonal changes, I've read some stuff even from like a hunger perspective.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's correct me if I'm wrong, ghrelin and leptin, and how this can play a role on hunger and satisfaction.
Yes.
Also impacting testosterone levels, both hormone. Do you mind touching a bit on how it comes into play with those hormones? So
growth hormone and testosterone, really important hormones, both in female and male development, for muscle mass, for growth, for repair, all of these things. And growth hormone is principally secreted during that non-REM third stage, the slow wave sleep stage, and testosterone during the REM stage of sleep. So these are so important that you get into those, but you get sufficient numbers of cycles of those. It's no good just having 3 cycles of sleep a night. You want to aim for those 5 or so cycles, which you'll get with your 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and therefore your body will be allowed to repair itself, to grow, to heal, to develop. And that interplay of hormones becomes so important. It's not just the fact that you're getting one or the other, but it's just the fact that you need both of them together in the correct amounts as well.
Makes sense. And how exactly does it work with the hunger hormones, and how can that kind of impact us?
So the hunger hormones, ghrelin and leptin,
I always mix those two up.
Feeling hungry and feeling full are important as well, because our desire to eat comes from a number of causes, but those two are important ones. That feeling of needing to eat, or that feeling of being full. Now, because their release is also related to sleep and good quality sleep, if they're out of whack, as it were, you might find yourself snacking more or constantly being hungry, and that, as we said, leads on to maybe gaining weight, becoming overweight and obese, and the obesity leading to heart problems and diabetes and everything. So we keep coming back to all of these chronic health problems that occur, but it's from that central pillar of the sleep affecting the hormones and affecting hormone imbalances which then go on to cause these chronic issues.
Okay, no, that's super helpful. Hopefully I'll keep it straight in my head.
That's okay, we all forget it.
Yeah. And last one that I'll bug you on as it pertains to hormones, but just curious to hear a bit more about that interplay with testosterone. Obviously, people typically associate this with males, but it's important in both genders. Would love to just hear a bit more about how sleep plays a role in terms of testosterone.
So testosterone is a very important hormone. When normally people think of testosterone, they think of men requiring testosterone. And it's true in men, testosterone is probably a more important hormone, but it's also important in female development. It's got a very impactful play in muscle development, in sexual development, and these kinds of things, especially in the growing individual and in males in later life as well, are so important to how you feel, how energetic you feel, how lively you feel. And the release of testosterone is very closely related to the REM part of sleep. And as you were talking about in the early part of this talk, where if someone's not getting that full range of sleep, they're missing out on an hour or two, we remind you that REM sleep occurs disproportionately more in the later parts of the sleep. So if you're not getting that later part of the sleep, you're not getting that testosterone release as well at that time.
Makes sense. I think in everything you just shared, you answered both the negative things that can happen if we don't sleep, and conversely, all the positive things that happen if we do sleep. In many ways, it's like a superpower that's just waiting for us to unlock. One additional question I had actually, before we move on to some other sleep-related concepts that I was keen to pick your brain on, was kind of the other extreme of, can we actually sleep too much? Is there a certain point when sleeping too much actually becomes negative?
Yeah. So before I talk about that, I do want to qualify these statements. They're correlative. They're not causative. So when we say that, we're saying that because if someone sleeps more than they're meant to, they're sleeping 10, 11, 12 hours a night, that's not necessarily the cause of their medical problems, but it is something that's very closely correlated to them. Now, most studies have shown that people that do sleep for that longer period of time tend to be slightly more overweight and therefore suffer from the cardiovascular and other metabolic problems that can occur with that. So you're right, there is this golden area where we're trying to get between 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but that's not the case always. If you've had a particularly vigorous day and you are tired and you find yourself sleeping 10, 11 hours, an extra thing, that's fine. We're not saying that if you do that all the time, you're going to get these problems. But one of the things that we do keep trying to come back to is for people to have this consistency with their amount of sleep. So if you're used to getting 7, 8, 9 hours of sleep a day, then try and do that all the time. It's okay on that odd weekend when everyone wants to lie in and you get that extra hour of sleep or something. Okay, that's fine. But don't do that where, okay, you'll sleep less during the week and then you'll catch that up at the weekends, or you'll do that more at the weekends. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. So the consistency part is really important. But going back to whether you can sleep too much, yes, you can sleep too much. There is this golden thing between 7 and 9 hours, and it's associated, sleeping too much, with heart problems, metabolic problems, and a general feeling of grogginess and lethargy. But whether that's the cause of it or closely associated, is very difficult to tell.
Yeah, fair enough, and appreciate that caveat. I guess one other important distinction we should probably make is time actually spent asleep versus time in bed. And I guess the body often, even if we spend a lot of time in bed, it's going to sleep or try its best to get that reset that it needs. And I guess one thing that came to mind is potentially, a risk of oversleeping too is just that you start to create that association of being awake while you're in bed.
Yeah, and that is something that's, it's fantastic, because I keep thinking back to myself. I remember times when speaking to colleagues and, you're studying for exams or you've got a big operation the next day and you're struggling to get sleep. You're lying in bed, you're tossing and turning. Now, if someone's come to me and talk about that, I would say, do you know what? You can't sleep. It's fine. Get up, go outside, do something else, go and read somewhere in a quiet, dark nook, whatever you need to do. Relax, meditate, whatever your thing is.
Mm-hmm.
But try and have it so that your bedroom is for sleeping. It's not somewhere to possibly lie in bed, doom scrolling on your phone, or catching up on the latest Netflix episode of whatever you're watching. Try and do those things outside of bed, because you want your bed to feel like that place that when you go into it, you're going to sleep. And that positive correlation is so important. I'm sure we'll come to talk about it, but the mind is so important in this stage of trying to get to sleep. It's not a case of you can just switch it on and off. Sometimes people need to be trained to do that. And I think that's a really important thing to think about.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's quite counterintuitive. It's how can you sleep better? Well, if you're laying there in the middle of the night and you're ruminating, actually the irony is it's better to just get out of bed, take a little break from trying to sleep, and then whatever the activity is, ideally it's something that promotes relaxation. Once you start to feel that sleepiness creep in again, return to the bed. And hopefully you'll have more success drifting off.
Absolutely. We all have our own methods for trying to get sleep, our own routines, and whatever works for you, that's great. But if you're struggling and if it's not happening, don't try and force yourself into it, because all you'll do is frustrate yourself more, and actually it'll probably take you even more time to get sleep. But it's not just the negative connotations of that day. Is that, it could happen again and again and again. And then you'll get into a situation where actually your bed is not that welcoming place where you're trying to go to sleep. It becomes somewhere where you struggle to get sleep. And the mind can very quickly associate that with a place where you struggle to get sleep. And then you're always trying to fight an uphill battle at that point.
Makes sense. And I guess, is that more or less kind of the essence of where sleep restriction therapy comes from?
Yes.
Where it's just a more extreme form, where essentially you're restricting the sleep, almost kind of breaking down that association with being awake in bed so that you can rebuild it and associate it with sleep as it should be.
So sleep restriction therapy is really interesting. So it's part of the cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia protocol, which actually is the single most effective form of therapy, both pharmaceutical or interventional, that you can get for sleep. And when you talk about it to people, the first time I heard it, I thought, what kind of nonsense is that? You mean I can't sleep, so you want me to sleep less? Okay, I'll try and wrap my head around it. But when you do it, you find that it actually works. And it's something that, look at, read about, and everything. And it does seem counterintuitive. How can you sleep better if you're sleeping less? But as you said, it's actually being asleep rather than ruminating on trying to sleep.
Awesome. No, thanks for sharing. Maybe to shift gears a bit, really keen to touch on a few overarching sleep concepts that I've heard floating around. You briefly spoke about chronotype earlier. Would love to better understand how this relates to our circadian rhythm. Yeah. Those are two concepts that my understanding is they're interrelated, but they're not exactly the same. So I would love to just get a bit of an overview of the circadian rhythm and how that is linked to our chronotype.
So circadian rhythm, for all you Latin scholars out there, circadia meaning close to a day. It's a natural biological response in mammals where the brain is adapted to a 24-hour day, to sleeping and waking at certain times. Now I must make sure that I pronounce this correctly, the Zeitgeber. Yeah,
that's a difficult one.
Yes. The thing that influences this is light, and particularly daylight, and its effect on what's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei of the hypothalamus. This is the central part of the brain where that circadian rhythm is controlled from. It's a response to light, and how that sleep can be, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping over the place here, but
no worries.
Sleep can be also divided up into these two broad things called process S and process C. The C part being the circadian rhythm part. There's a hormone released by this small gland in the brain called the pineal gland, the hormone called melatonin. Now, melatonin is released in the absence of light, and specifically in the absence of daylight. And what melatonin does is it then acts on the brain to initiate that sleep. I'm sure most people listening will have heard of melatonin, and some may have even heard of melatonin supplements, thinking that's how you get to sleep. It's something that helps initiate sleep, but it's not something that controls the sleep. But this circadian rhythm, this 24-hour rhythm of the body, isn't just to do with sleep. It's to do with hormone releases. It's to do with metabolic processes and the like. And it's how the mammalian body has adapted to that 24-hour cycle. Now, the other half of this process S, has got to do with another chemical called adenosine. Now, going back to your biology days, when there's cellular activity in the brain, the thing that's used for that activity is something called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And when that breaks down, it produces adenosine, which is a purine nucleoside. Now, I promise that's the last time I'll say that. But what adenosine does is it builds up through the day. So you can think of adenosine just, you're awake, your mind's active, it's constantly building up. And then adenosine is the thing that makes you tired. It acts on the brain, on these adenosine receptors to make you feel tired. So when you hear people talk about sleep pressure, it's that build-up of adenosine happening all the time, through those 16 hours. And you'll get to this point where, it's built up through the day, it's come to night, you're not getting lights coming in through your retina, so melatonin's starting to be released. Melatonin saying, hey, it's time to go to sleep. The adenosine saying, yes, there's plenty of us as well, let's get you to sleep. So those two distinct processes, but things that work together, get you into that sleep cycle. They work separately, but they work complementary. And that's essentially what builds up to that pressure of trying to get to sleep.
Okay, no, that's super helpful. You read my mind, because I was going to bring up sleep pressure, but maybe just to try and re-summarize a bit of what you said. So essentially, sometimes I like to think in terms of charts, because I'm a nerd like that. But if we had level of alertness on the y-axis and time of day on the x-axis, is it fair to say that our circadian rhythm, in terms of the shape of that line, looks relatively similar across you and me? And I guess bringing adenosine into the picture, when we have our peak alertness, that's probably going to be when we have our lowest levels of adenosine. Is that correct?
That's correct, because when you're sleeping, the adenosine that's all being built up is removed from the brain. And it's only being produced when you're awake and your brain is doing its mental exercises through the day. And so vice versa, just to, I guess, really hit the point home, then at our lowest levels of alertness or biggest dip, that's conversely when we're probably going to see the highest levels of adenosine. Yeah. I explain it to my children like, think of your sleep pressure as a balloon. You're constantly blowing into it through the day, and it gets to a point where the pressure is so much that that's what's putting you to sleep. And then while you're asleep, all the air comes out of it, and then the next morning again you're building it up, and that's the adenosine part of it. Whereas the melatonin part of your circadian rhythm is just that initiator telling you, hey, it's time to go to sleep.
That's really interesting what you mentioned about how our sleep changes over time. I was curious, I've heard or read about sleep as you age, and how it's not necessarily that you need less sleep. A lot of people say when you're older, you just simply need less sleep, but it's not so clear cut.
No.
My understanding is essentially that much like as we age, it becomes more difficult to put on muscle mass. We still need muscle mass, but our ability to put it on, to retain it, decreases. Is it the same with sleep, or how does that work?
Absolutely. You got that spot on, actually, because people think, when you're older, you need less sleep, you'll just go to sleep early or you'll wake up early. Yes, there is a slight shift in the chronotype to that earlier waking, but actually, you still need that good amount of sleep, that 7 to 9 hours of restorative sleep. In fact, I would go on to say that it is probably even more important at that stage, because you're really looking for that physical and mental restoration to occur at its peak then. But unfortunately, because as we age, there are changes that grow on in the brain, and metabolically you may need to get up to use the bathroom at night, it becomes more difficult to get that quantity of sleep or that quality of really good sleep. So, you may find this idea that when you're older you need less sleep, but you're absolutely right, it's not true. You actually need the same amount of sleep, it's just it becomes more difficult for us as we get older.
And just to dig a bit deeper on that, are there also changes going on with hormones? For example, melatonin, as you mentioned, kind of this timing official or alarm bell when it comes to sleep. Does that change as we age? I had read that one of the scientific cases where there's a good amount of evidence sort of backing the use of melatonin is actually in older adults, sort of 50, 55 plus.
Yes.
And sort of the mechanism behind that was essentially that your ability to produce melatonin declines, and hence there's a more legitimate case to supplement it at elder age.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Because of the changes that occur in the brain, the output of melatonin slightly decreases as we get older, but also the brain's ability to act on the melatonin also decreases slightly. So yes, there is a case that, as we get older, it becomes more difficult to initiate sleep. But even in those cases, using the CBTI methods can be actually really impactful and probably as effective as taking the melatonin supplements and melatonin medications, agonists that are available.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, yes, we typically produce less, and also on top of that, we don't use it as effectively.
That's
but
right.
That being said, popping that melatonin capsule or gummy, it's not necessarily going to be the magic solution, and
No.
certainly it isn't the only solution.
No, because going back to the first principles, melatonin is there to help us get to sleep. But you'll find that, when you're older, actually it's not really the problem of getting to sleep, it's the problem of staying asleep, having that quality of sleep, and how quickly you wake up after falling asleep, how many times your sleep is interrupted, because all of these things add up. So the melatonin agonists and the supplements won't necessarily help on that, because you'll get sleep, it's just you won't be able to stay asleep.
All right, I'll resist the urge to dive any deeper on supplements, since we'll definitely make time for that later. Maybe we jump into sleep debt. My understanding, I guess if we were to put it into the form of a mathematical equation, it would be the total amount you sleep is one component, the amount you actually need, and then essentially the difference between those two would be your sleep debt. Am I oversimplifying? Is that more or less what it is?
But that nerd in you is coming out with the equations.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. It's the way to describe it is, some people want to party hard, catch up on the weekend or on their day off, thinking, I'll get 4 hours of sleep, but don't worry, at the weekend, I'll sleep for 15 hours. I'll catch up on all those hours that I missed out on. But unfortunately, that's not the case, because there's a number of things that come into play there. If you're sleeping less during the week, you're not getting the amount of REM sleep that you require. Again, going back and saying that REM sleep occurs predominantly, occurs more so in the second half of your sleep cycles. But then it's also a case of that you build up, you miss an hour here, you miss 2 hours there, and so on. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, I'll sleep for 5 hours extra. It doesn't work like that. And in fact, most studies that have looked at quality of sleep and looked at these kinds of outputs have found that the best things occur when people are consistent in the amount of sleep. Now, we're not telling you that, if you go somewhere, you have that time when you only got 4 or 5 hours sleep, that's fine. Sleep in. No one is saying that you can't do that. But as a term for long-term progress, it's something I would definitely advise against.
Mm-hmm. No, makes sense, I think. Yeah, probably that social jet lag, so to speak, is one of the most common cases of sleep debt, where you sleep less during the weekdays, and then you do your best to catch up on the weekends. But as you rightfully pointed out, it's not so simple, because just because you sleep more, it's not necessarily going to be as good quality. You're disrupting the element of consistency. So I think, very, very useful to keep in mind. All right, well, that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and most importantly, learned something along the way. Ideally, that you'll remember and be able to incorporate into your daily health routine. A big, huge shout out to Jatin, our expert guest, as well as you, the viewer, for making it all the way through, showing a real commitment to your health. Also, a quick ask from our side, whatever platform you found us on, if you could just give us a quick like, subscribe, review, feedback, you name it, we really appreciate it. Last but not least, thank you, Dendro, for sponsoring this content. Although we try and keep it as ad-free as possible, it ultimately does come with some time and monetary commitment. So thank you, Dendro, for providing that. For those unaware, Dendro is a sleep health platform that we're currently building, starting with our flagship Sleep Health Supplement Night Restore. For more info on that, check out our website, dendrohealth.com, or check out the links directly in the show notes below. Anyways, with that, hope to catch you in the next one. Don't forget to stay healthy, and let's add life to yours.